In November 1993, more than 2 years after the African burial ground was discovered during construction of a new federal office tower, what was once a construction site, an excavation pit, was recovered.
The find has become an historic passageway, an open window to the American past, and the human remains once buried here were prepared for an important new stage.
Bones were separated, cataloged, and packaged for transport to Washington, D.C., to Howard University, the nation's center of African American anthropology. It is the location of the next major phase of scientific and cultural analysis, a process that will last for the next 5 to 7 years. Here, at the only exposed portion of the burial ground, some 400 buried individuals had been removed. An estimate of 100 to 200 remain buried here. Although the name of not one person is known, by some they were treated as family.
The departure of the bones was celebrated by many who had embraced them as their own.
The discovery of the African burial ground, said to be the largest burial ground for early African Americans in the United States, is a link, a key link, between our present and our past. The transfer of these human remains from New York City to Howard University is an important and a touching moment for all of us. These bones tell a story. They tell us of a life of hardship, made harder because of ignorance and prejudice.
In this box, brought to the temple, were the last remains to be carried the following day to Howard University. Will they help to tell the story? Like archaeological finds in the ancient world, the discovery of the African burial ground beneath the tall buildings and streets of New York City reclaimed the remnants of a little-known culture and a history lost and forgotten.
The rediscovery of the burial ground made me aware of certain aspects of Black existence in America that I either didn't know before or that I hadn't paid sufficient attention to.
I was chilled. I still am. And like all poets and philosophers and house painters and bricklayers, I fantasize, and I imagine a great, great, great grandparent of mine being in that lot.
I myself came from the South, the agricultural South, and most of the Black experience has sort of been focused in that area. The magnificent story of roots, the family in the South, the slavery as practiced in the South, the lifestyle in the South. The finding of the grave reminds us that that was not the totality of the Black experience. It wasn't even the totality of the slave experience.
The discovery of the burial ground stimulated a new discussion of American history. It initiated a fresh examination of the contributions of enslaved Africans in the shaping and growth of America. For scientists and historians, and for writers and poets and artists, those who help us understand and even recreate a culture, the find provides new answers and new questions. Only through a comprehensive inquiry of those voiceless and long-buried people can we learn more about our past.
They were not the ones who gave us spirituals. They were not the ones who gave us Brer Rabbit and the folk tales that I know familiarly from the South. They lived an entirely different life. And I'd like to know what that life was. I can't imagine sugar cane being planted down there, or cotton being picked down in the Battery, or tobacco. So what kind of life did they live?
This area along the East River waterfront was the center of the Port of New York in the early 19th century. during New York's age of sail. After the American Revolution, New York became one of the primary international ports, one of the primary ports in the world.
A lot of people, young people, say, my parents came from Greece, my parents came from Rome, my parents came from Finland, and we were poor, and we came, and my parents got jobs, and they worked in the ditches, they built the canals, and the railroads, and gradually they got into the American mainstream. What happened to black folks? What was different? The record of distortion and deletion of our history is extraordinary. And New York is one of those places where there are examples of the amnesia that the culture imposed on facts about black people. We were here, but we were here to some degree just as animals were here, as cows and horses and cattle, as if we made no impact, as if we were not a social group, as if we, in fact, didn't exist in the same sense that normal humans exist. In order to remedy that, we need to fill in the story of what America truly was like, and our past, therefore, becomes important, and the burial ground, in that sense, becomes important to us as black people, and to us as Americans, and to the whole country. We need to know the facts.
A lot of the archaeological excavations to date in the city have taken place along the area of the East River Port. And in the 18th and early 19th century, this is where a lot of the rich people lived. So we really don't have any samples of the lifeways of the poor during that time.
Probably the largest frequency of materials from the grave site are coffin nails or fragments of coffin nails.
These were very poor people, so shroud pins were also plentiful. These plain copper pins were used to secure the simple white cloth or shrouds which wrapped most of the bodies.
This is actually a musket ball that was recovered from one of the burials. It was wedged up against a rib bone from a female.
This woman's death may have been caused by this musket ball. Most of the artifacts were no larger than a thumbnail. Could any give hope to learning about this lost culture?
There isn't any African American or African culture lost. One sees it in the dance and hears it in the music, tastes it in the food, enjoys it in the walk of the women and so forth. No, the culture has not been lost. To find 200 years later the veritable bones, that now is not romance. That is practical, that is tangible, and that puts us in touch with the people who were slaves 200 years ago. And that's very real. The tangible evidence of their lives resides in their deaths, so their bones then are representation of their lives.
This particular discovery is important because African Americans in particular are an orphan people on this continent. There are people who see these individuals as their lost family members.
The family tree of millions of Africans was lost during the Middle Passage, that voyage which brought enslaved Africans across the Atlantic.
I have friends and colleagues who describe the Atlantic Ocean as their Auschwitz. And they do so because it's their belief that many of their ancestors are dead in the Atlantic Ocean. The Middle Passage speaks to that arduous journey that Africans took against their will, and it really deals with that place that separates us from our homeland.
Can we ever know the home countries of the people who were buried here? Of the 400 humans unearthed, there is not one who is known by name. How then, scientists ponder, will it ever be possible to know any more about them, to determine even their place of birth?
The long-term plan is to be able to use genetic markers to reconstruct African American history.
The technology has just reached the point to allow us to extract DNA from the bone as well as from the hair of those individuals for which we have hair. In all likelihood, there are people buried in the burial ground who lived in the early 18th century in New York, who had not only come from various parts of Africa, but who had been to or been born in parts of South America, Brazil, and the West Indies.
Using bones that have been buried for several hundred years is certainly one of the more difficult ways of trying to analyze genetic information in a population. But with the available techniques of molecular biology, it certainly should be possible.
Africans came to this continent against their will, speaking many, many languages. They came here in slave ships that we know were reprehensible. Many died on the way here, and a great deal was lost. Not just culture as it pertains to a particular African group, but family, language, sense of self, and that is very hard to reclaim.
Language has been lost, but there have been accommodations made in the English language by the African speakers, which almost leveled out the losing of Fanti and Tree and Yoruba and Ahanta and Ashanti, etc. So when two black men meet, black American men, and if they like each other and are working at brotherhood, they say, hey, man, how you been? So there is melodically implied a familial relationship, which if they had the language of Bambara or Bassa, they would have used the words. But they don't have the words, so they use the melody.
And it's good to run across a find like this to let you know that the memory did live, and it did survive the Atlantic Ocean, and it did survive years of enslavement, and it survived, and now we have this tomb that showed us how it survived all the way to the grave. Their tomb happens to be a structure that's maybe 2.5 feet wide, 6 feet long and shorter. It may not be an opulent tomb of the pharaohs, but it's still their tomb. It's a treasure, a real treasure, because it represents a real link.
Photographer Chester Higgins has created thousands of images of African cultures throughout the world, contributing to the quest for scientific knowledge and cultural information. All reflect a part of the African diaspora, the movement of African peoples throughout the globe.
Well, when I saw traits in these burials that were African, I was quite moved in an awesome sort of way.
This is an adult, a woman, who has ornamentally filed incisors, which should allow us to understand her specific origins in Africa and her status within that society, perhaps.
Filing teeth at puberty was a ritual in some parts of Africa in the 16 and 1700s. This practice continues in some areas of Africa today.
She is wearing a beaded belt, waist beads, 110 blue and white beads interspersed with cowrie shells, not unlike what Akan women in Ghana sometimes wear. Here's someone who you feel you know as a human being right away because there are such distinctive artifacts.
The archaeological finds in the arid regions of Egypt have survived for thousands of years. In New York, with more rain, more humidity, and greater variation in the weather, the artifacts and skeletal remains at the burial ground, which is relatively young, have not survived as well.
Preservation in dry, arid environments for many objects is better there than here. Pollutants are really now our big concern. The physical remains that I've worked on, say in the Middle East, were more intact than some of the materials that I've seen coming out of the Foley Square site.
The most striking individuals found in the burial ground are those that offer the most information most quickly. I'm impressed by one woman who's buried with her newborn. This is always a touching thing to observe in a burial. Someone who died with a child, surrounded by a scene that must have involved great love and pain.
Examining the teeth of adults, which developed in childhood, can determine at what age he or she experienced a bout of disease or poor nutrition. Analysis of teeth and other bones may even indicate what kinds of food people ate, how much meat or corn or vegetables.
The kinds of diseases and nutritional problems that they had will give us a window on the conditions of their lives, the social and economic conditions that are reflected in the physical quality of life.
In our society, we talk a lot about slaves. These slaves were enslaved persons. Prior to coming here, they were doctors, they were teachers, they were mediators, they were parents. They had occupations, they had skills, they had character. Some were wonderful and probably some were rascals.
They must have assisted in the normal commercial life of the community. And they must have done that in a significant way, else why bring so many to America?
I can see the people who look like that they spent their life plowing a mule, or who prayed to their gods, or the parents who had the awesome responsibility of raising their children. When I look at the paintings left by the ancient Egyptians, people of Kemet, the land of the blacks, I'm really moved by what a document they left behind. And it's because of that document that these visual artists left behind that we know the most about these people.
Those buried in the African burial ground left no paintings. Few images are left, only glimpses. We may one day know from where they came. Left out of our history books, can we ever know again who they were or picture what they did?
So history has a repository of very necessary information, and we must dig it out, and we need science to dig it out. We need scholarship to dig it out. We need research to dig it out. But once all of that is there and put on the table, we need somebody, the imaginative artist, to come along and synthesize it into what vision mankind requires, or man and womankind requires, to make a life at this moment.
Several New York City schools established art programs in response to the burial ground discovery. In community centers, adults too learn and try to recreate.
I would love to see young black men and women, young white, young Spanish-speaking, young Native American, just taking it. Something will happen. I don't know what, but it would be very important for the condition, which is the burial site, the condition which is wounded need. It's important that the condition of the burial ground act upon them.
This burial ground belongs to the nation as a whole. It speaks to more than just African Americans. It's a national history. There are aspects of this discovery which relate to every single person in this country. Black, white, doesn't matter, because it's a shared history.
I, as an artist, look upon the past as a resource. I would be prepared to let the past bury the past, except that we can't do that. I want the bones to speak to me in ways that makes it possible for me to sit down and tell my grandchildren the marvelous stories about their ancestors, what they did and what they accomplished. And I, as a writer, look upon that, the past, as a source for the stories I need to tell my grandchildren to inspire them to become men and women. That's what it means to me.
You know, it's John Rodriguez, the black man, befriending the red man and trading. They're showing him the furs, he's showing them the tools, and it's a mutual exchange. Africans did have great skills when they were taking care of the farms and when they were doing just different chores. You see us working. That's exactly what you see. You see us working, you see us lifting rocks, building fences, you see us plowing the fields. That scene is just showing that, yes, we were a very busy people, whether we wanted to be or not. We didn't really have much choice in the matter, but the fact is that we did build this country. In the burial ground scene, we have a picture of several people standing around a coffin. And this coffin is just a pine box. It's not a good piece of land, it's just a piece of land. that nobody else wanted, but that's what we were given to bury our dead.
If I had the privilege of asking those people who were buried in that ground, and if I could ask them one question, it would not be about the details of their life. I know slavery, I know history. I would ask this question: what did you hope for? And all that happened to you, what did you continually hope for and tell your children? That would be the question I would ask them.
The greatest song, greatest piece of art to me, which came out of my people's turmoil, travail here, is sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long ways from home, a long ways from home. There's a eulogy. That is it. For every soul buried there, that's the statement.
Truly, the function of art at the highest level is to give meaning to brute fact. So yes, this could and should be the beginning of a renaissance culturally. Their lives, their dramas, their dances, their costumes, their speech, their impact on America then and America now could be the source of a new cultural statement by us in this country.
And ultimately, this analysis of these remains will enlarge the discussion about African American culture, what our culture history is as a people, and we await this new information so that we can talk about it.
At the university, the ultimate laboratory examination and analysis began, a process of study that may take as long as 5 to 7 years.
I think the most impressive thing that comes out of all of this is that African American infants and children are represented in skeletal populations at higher rates than European American infants and children. So what we see is that African American children were at greater risk of dying. And therefore, what we see during the 18th and 19th century is a pattern of high infant mortality in the African American community that we see today.
In November 1993, the last transport of the unearthed remains was received at Howard. Carried preciously by an elder from the New York community, the contents of the final conveyance were in a small box clad in royal African cloth and offered as one would present a treasure and received in kind.
It was very, very hard for our ancestors. It was hard to be an African in America then, and it's hard to be an African in America today. It's hard to be an Indian in America then, and it's hard to be an Indian in America today. We have those common problems that are confronting us in our society. This song is to prepare the atmosphere, prepare you in your hearts for the ancestors to come in. Through our ancestors, we're all related, right?
From the chapel, the procession continued to the grounds of the Howard University campus for a welcoming libation, an ancient practice of pouring a blessed liquid or spirits upon the ground in honor of ancestors.
This is a very special and historic occasion. It's an occasion where we remember what our ancestors did and left for us, those who came before us. We remember their agony and their happiness and their sorrows. We pour libation on Mother Earth to call on the Almighty Supreme Being for generations to come.
Frederick Douglass is on. Martin Luther King Jr. is on.
Malcolm X.
Malcolm X, my one dinner that.
Lorraine Hansberry.
Lawrence Hansberry is on.
Mary Cloud Bethune.
Mary Cloud Bethune is on.
W.E.B. Du Bois.
W.E.B. Du Bois is on.
Sojourner Truth.
Sojourner Truth is on.
Means we need unity. We need to become one across the Atlantic Ocean, on the continent, and in the New World. We need to become one in order to build a better future for ourselves and our offsprings, so that those who follow and those who came first will be proud of what we will also leave behind.
And so it is in that spirit that we celebrate our ancestors, many of whom we don't know their names, we don't know where they lived, but we know that we come from them.
This day, November 5th, 1993, is a gift to all of us from our ancestors.
We have the right and the power to look at the past and to demand of the past some answers to the dilemmas we face now. My children cried desperately for a sense of who they are, and to the degree that those bones have something to tell them that helps me fulfill their hunger and their need, that's what takes me to the bones. I hate to disturb the dead except for some good purpose, and this would be a great purpose, to excuse our robbing their graves.
We thank you for what our eyes have seen tonight. Help us to continue to stand on the shoulders of those who went before us. Give us strength and give us a future.